Now I can be heard. All right. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Susan Smith Richardson, Managing Editor at The Guardian US. So I'm excited to host this conversation with these foundation leaders who are going to talk to us about what they fund, how they make funding decisions, and what success looks like to them. So a couple of things before we get started. If you look at the screen behind us, we're going to be taking your questions. That's really important, and I'm sure a lot of you have many, many questions to ask. So we're going to ask you to use Slido for your questions. So if you look now and you go to slido.com, if you'll write down this code so we can make sure that we're seeing your questions in real time. So write down the code now. It's 284517. Give you a second to record that, and then we're going to get started. A couple other things. So we're going to focus the last 10 to 15 minutes really on the questions, but as we go through the conversation, I'm going to try to sprinkle in a few questions here and there as they seem kind of appropriate, so we can get in more of your questions and not just save everything until we get to the end. So, okay, let me introduce our panelists, and I'm going to start all the way on the other side of the table, no political spectrum involved. But before I do that, first I just want to say to all the panelists, happy Ketanji Brown Jackson Day. We can't have a conversation about democracy, journalism, and in a sense, funding and power without recognizing a benchmark. So there we have it. It's a big moment. So I want to start with our panelists with Jacqueline Borders. She's a program officer at the Arthur M. Blank Foundation in Atlanta, Georgia, where she leads the foundation's democracy portfolio and civic engagement and the Racial Justice Fund. Erika L. Woods is with the Ford Foundation. She's a senior program officer on the civic engagement and government team. Her grant making speaks to democratic participation in the United States and so many other aspects. And you might know this person here. His name is Craig Newmark. He's founder of Craig Newmark Philanthropies, and he is also the founder of Craigslist, and he has told me to tell you he is possibly the Kim Kardashian of cyber. So I was just going to say I might not need to introduce him, but anyway, now you know. All right, so I'm going to start with Jacoria. We are in a moment. We just talked about KBJ's confirmation, but there are larger issues moving through the U.S. and global society around democracy and issues of representation. So you're actually in the process of building out the Journalism Program Fund at the Blank Foundation as part of its larger democracy program. So with everything happening here in the U.S. now, talk to us about how you landed on journalism as a key funding area, why now, and how you see that connecting with this democratic moment, if you will.
Absolutely. Sorry. There we go, following directions. Good morning, everyone. Well, afternoon, how are y'all feeling? Y'all feeling good? Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you to The Guardian for having us here and all of my fellow panelists. I'm Jacqueline Borders, and just to back it up and give you a little kind of history, the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation was founded in 1995, and we historically kind of invested in a little bit of everything in Atlanta and Montana, which is where our home base is. And ultimately, after 25 years and over $800 million, our founder has signed the Giving Pledge, and now he is intending to accelerate his impact to give away over half of his wealth while he's still alive, and doing that in a very targeted way so that we can measure that impact. And so in that, we have four new collective areas of giving, which include democracy, which is the work that I lead, in that, which is civic participation, as well as journalism, youth development as it relates to workforce and alternative pathways to opportunity, as well as the environment as it relates to conservation and climate resiliency. And so these are the existential issues of our time, and that's what's in deep importance to the overall family. And across the foundation, the organization will look to address opportunities that address these crises, but also bind us as a nation. Geographically, our work will still take place a large part in Atlanta and in Georgia and in Montana, but we seek to see how we can have national impact with partners like Ford to ultimately really see how we can create ripple effects in the South and fund those doing the work. I think with that said, it's evident that all of your work in journalism under this new area of democracy is really a pillar of our foundation, and we're about to go through a deep sense of learning journey with our board to understand exactly what that means to us. So I don't have an exact answer as of right now of what that will look like, but over the next, this is all brand new. This started about 6 months ago, I guess you could say. So over time, we'll look to the experts in this space to really help us learn what that looks like across these 4 collective giving areas. Thank you for that question.
Okay, sure. So I want to piggyback on that and go to Erika next. Before I go there, I just noticed this question on Slido, and I want to address this. With the exception of the Blank Foundation, our 2 other funders here do support global support initiatives globally, just to be clear. The Blank Foundation is a U.S. domestic foundation, or funds within the U.S. So let me kind of piggyback on what Erika on what Jacoria was saying. And Erika, you're engaged in this work around democracy at the Ford Foundation. How does journalism fit into Ford's overall mission? And then kind of second part of the question is to look at how it fits specifically with the civic engagement work that you're doing.
Sure. Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate The Guardian for the invitation to be in this beautiful city with all of you. And to my co-panelists, it's so great to be in conversation with you all. So the Ford Foundation's overall mission is to disrupt inequality around the world. We have regional offices throughout the Global South, and our headquarters is in New York City. We have a $16 billion endowment. And for our journalism work, we believe that marginalization and misrepresentation in media and culture produces and reflects inherent and deep inequality. And so our work around journalism really intends to kind of move voices from the margins to the mainstream with the belief that that will disrupt inequality by lifting up underrepresented, unheard voices to strengthen the understanding of human complexity and disrupt inequality. So that's how we think about it. Our work around journalism is very much focused on marginalized communities. That's people of color, women, disabled people. How do we tell their stories? How do we make sure they're telling their stories? How do we make sure that media and journalism reflects their stories? I sit on, as Susan said, the civic engagement and government team at Ford. My work really focuses around sort of the structural pieces of democracy. I describe myself as the wonky lawyer on the team. I care a lot about laws and policies and institutions, but really always trying to center people and communities in that work. The work around kind of structural democracy, again, sort of wonky, can be technical, can be legal, somewhat quote-unquote elite. Often quite siloed and separate from movement and the grassroots. And we really do our work at Ford to try to bring those 2 pieces together to try to create a movement for democracy. And certainly journalism and telling the truth and making sure citizens and folks in community are informed, are able to make wise decisions, are able to have informed opinions, are able to engage based on truth and honesty. Sits central to the work that we're doing around that. So,
thanks. So, Craig, I want to go to you and 2 things. You to talk about the areas that you support, and then how you see journalism intersecting with some of those areas.
Okay. I'm supporting a broad range of interests. A lot of it has to do with the first expression of democracy is that you want to treat people like you want to be treated. I generalized from there. In U.S. high school, U.S. history, I learned that a trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy. And I observed that in 2016, the immune system of democracy in the U.S. Failed. So work needs to address that. Plus, I have my rabbi who died shortly after the 2016 election. That was a guy named Leonard Cohen. And he wrote something, a prayer called Democracy, which in fact articulates my mission statement and my view of democracy. So I just go on from there. So I'm supporting a number of activities. In the US, there are major threats to voting rights, trying to stop people from voting. Good progress there is that, like the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, just had a new leader appointed, Maya Wiley, who I met during her campaign for mayor in New York like months ago. And as of this morning, we started playing email tag about getting together probably next week. So the idea is to find areas which help and then proceed with them. One area involves major investments countering disinformation. And while the bulk are based in the US, there is some work I do, which I don't really talk about, which involves disinformation operations in Europe, including Poland, Hungary, and Italy. There I don't talk about those because the participants are in physical danger. I am doing a great deal now of work now more countering cyber attacks, and that's in the process of being announced right now. I don't know if I want to be the Kim Kardashian of cyber, but if that's useful and funny, I have no dignity, so I'm quite willing to volunteer in that matter. In another smaller area, still under development, I am very concerned with harassment online, and I'm most concerned with the harassment of women journalists, since they get the worst of it. And to that effect, I've funded a project starting with the International Women's Media Foundation to try to get them to work with women journalists to figure out how to fight it off, how to mitigate the effects, and how to stop that. That's also with PEN America, and I think Victoria is here somewhere working on that. And the people implementing the mechanisms along these lines are at what used to be called Hollaback, although they've just changed their name to Right to Be. So I figure that these are things that people can work on. I figure that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend towards justice, and that individuals who have some resources can do something about it. After all, a nerd's got to do what a nerd's got to do.
Thanks, Craig. You know, we have a number of questions for all of us to talk about, but I kind of want to pick up on this question about having the resources and having the ability to support and identify issues and how that plays out in grant making. So, you know, there's a lot of conversation going on in the foundation world now about who gets to decide. You know, it may be there's foundation money, but what's the process for engaging people who are affected by some of the issues you care about in the process of deciding, you know, grants? And we don't have to start with you. I'm going to put you on the side on that one. But I'm curious with, you know, Jacoria and with Erika, how those conversations play out.
Everyone's like, so
Yes, I know you do.
I will say we engage deeply with grantees and other experts in the field around our strategy. We do strategy refreshes and design new strategies every 5 years at Ford, which includes an evaluation of the strategy that we've been working under for the previous 5 years and then a sort of visioning for the future. And we are on my team right now just launching this, so we'll be going through this over the summer, and we are having one-on-one conversations and then also group conversations and convenings to make sure that we are being informed and getting the thoughts and ideas from not just, as I said, our grantees for sure, but also other leaders in the field. So I think that is one way that we work to make sure that we are being as informed as possible. And you know, I will say from time to time at Ford there are advisory committees that are put together based on the team and the topic that do also help inform when there's an RFP process and other things. So it's not a regular part of our grant making decision, but it is from time to time when it's appropriate or when folks deem it appropriate. We do bring folks in to be part of advisory committees.
Jacoria, did you have any thoughts on this, or, yeah?
Yeah, so I would say for us, like I said before, we are in a transformative period right now where our entire organization is being revamped. We're at a team of about 18 right now, and we'll be at 43 by the end of the year. That being said, in these new areas of youth development, democracy, the environment, all these places, we have subject matter experts that are in these spaces. I speak directly to the democracy work that I get to lead is I came from the space, right? So being able to come from the space, you have a lot of existing relationships. We always talk about how we want to look to our grantees, but you also want to look to the end users. So who are the folks that you're seeking to serve? And you start with them and center their voice, and folks who wouldn't normally have access to a large philanthropic organization. And so for me, I like to go directly to the source and understand who we are funding, who are we not funding, why, who is missing, and who needs to be added to the table. So I think, those are things that I personally, as a program officer in my work, I look for across. And then I also look to other funders. So Erika has been an amazing partner in Ford. There's not many funders in the U.S. in the democracy space at the scale in which Ford and now the Blank Foundation funds. And so for us, it's really, if I can speak for us, it's really about finding those who need the resources that are doing the work on the ground, building relationships. And sometimes it's not always about money. Money is important, but sometimes it's also about the leverage you can yield, especially in the space of democracy, as a institution that has a lot of power and a lot of sway, and quite frankly, a lot of influence, and leveraging your social capital to then also introduce your funders and advocate, your grantees, and advocate to them, for them on their behalf to other funders as well, to kind of bring more people to the party to want to play in the sandbox with us.
Craig, thank you.
Okay. I'm not very smart, so in the areas I've decided to support, I'll find people who are, and then ask for their opinions. For example, someone I've relied on for some years is someone named Erika Wood at the Ford Foundation. In general, though, I'll find people who do seem to know something about an area, and then I'll talk to them so they can advise me. Because frankly, trying to do that on one's own requires things like nuanced social skills and like, have you met me? So for the most part, I'll find good people who can recommend things to me. My biggest challenge, because I've gotten myself into trouble, have been that I have to find groups who are not full of, what are called white saviors. These are folks who talk about serving underserved groups, but they never actually do. And in the US, what I've seen is what happens is they actually get people killed. So again, my deal is that I'm very aware of my limitations. I have a large number of limitations. I know I'm not as funny as I think I am, but I know also that I can get help from people who do know what's going on. So I rely on the kindness of strangers and proceed from there.
Thank you all for that answer. So let's talk a little bit about impact. You just said beyond readership numbers or social reach. How do you evaluate the success of a journalism project, and what do you hope to see as outcomes? So, Erika, I'm gonna pick on you and start with you.
Sure. So I think we really are not super focused on quantitative things. We're not looking at how many hits or how many whatevers, likes or retweets or whatever. We're much more looking at qualitative measures. So we want to know who's being focused in the story, who's being reached by your story. Are you connecting with folks that maybe living in sort of what we call media deserts, right? Or places where it's very hard to get trustworthy, quality information and journalism. Are you reaching those folks? Who are you featuring in your stories? Whose voices are you lifting up? How are you telling those stories? And then who's telling the stories? Who's on your staff? Who's on your team? Who's out in the field? Whose voices are being brought into that? So that's really how we're looking at the journalism. We really are trying to shift, right? Who's telling stories, what stories are being told, and who's hearing them. So we're looking at it from that level. And then, I think I'll just say from my personally, in my, as a program officer, just other things outside of the strategy that I consider in this is, how are you connecting? Who are you working with? Who are you collaborating with? What kind of partner are you? How are you sharing credit? How are you lifting up other people's voices? All of that, right? Because we really want to be supporting kind of a field and an ecosystem. We want this work to be moving in a collaborative, aligned way. And so I think another thing that I look for is just those connection points and collaborative points.
Okay, and measuring outcome. Jacoria, do you want to weigh in on this one?
So I'll say from a journalism perspective, we have not made any grants in this space as of yet. So when we're still in the process of developing our strategy. So as it relates to journalism, that is yet to be determined, and our board will go through that process. But as it relates to, I'll say, my democracy portfolio in our organizations, we were very intentional this past year in 2021 and made about $10 million in grants to civic organizations across the South and with a strong presence in the Southeast. And in that, it was intentionally done in an off-season year, which we would consider, and it was done in 2021 to help strengthen and build the capacity and sustainability of the organizations, because there's a lot of money that flows in Georgia. There's a lot of money that flows in election years in 2024 and 2020, but nobody funds in the years when they don't have a big election. So, but midterms matter, local elections matter, and if we really believe in a sustainable democracy, then we have to fund the folks that are doing the work consistently, and not just when there's an axe to grind or when everybody's paying attention. And so for us, it was very intentional for us. The only measure of outcome in this learning portfolio that we have right now in democracy is that the organizations have the resources they need to be able to build strong and resilient organizations consistently. And so that for us is a strong outcome, is to making sure that we are supporting those who are supporting us.
Okay. Thank you. We'll let you follow on that.
We will want to support efforts that have some real social impact, that really get things done. And these are long-term, multi-year efforts. And at my age, I only have a few good years left, this being the beginning of my farewell tour. So what I'm trying to do is work with organizations that have some opportunities to disrupt flows of disinformation, and to remind otherwise respected news organizations that amplifying disinformation is not a trustworthy activity. To that end, for example, I'm working with Columbia Journalism Review to help put into place public editors for publications like New York Times, which has a problem with the amplification of disinformation. Specifically, there are a problem with both sidesism. So the idea is to fund long-term efforts where organizations will try to learn something from what happened in 2016 and apply that, because frankly, we're in trouble in the US, and I'm hoping that we can survive November, and if we do that, survive beyond that. My plans are to put into mechanisms which will keep going even after the ending of my farewell tour.
So I'm noticing some of the questions coming into Slido, and thank you for those. There are a couple that I do want to get to sooner rather than later. Let me ask two more things, though, of the panel, just to kind of level set and get some more information clear. And that's this. Do you distinguish, just for folks who are sitting here thinking, I want to know more about what you fund, so do you distinguish between nonprofit and for-profit news in your funding? Do you fund both? Why or why not? And are there some specific type of outlets that you're more interested in? So do you fund nonprofit and for-profit news? You want to start, Erika?
Yeah, we do fund both. I know in the panel that I attended yesterday, this idea of expenditure responsibility grants came up, and we certainly do those for organizations that are not 501c3 tax exempt. But we do prioritize and have a real focus on journalists and organizations that make their product available for free. So that is one of the things that we do take into account as we are considering our strategy, which is who's able to access the information.
Craig?
It seems that the people who are most committed, most interested in democracy in the U.S. are generally nonprofit organizations. One that occurred to me earlier today is ProPublica. which has at least one representative here. And the folks like at the Washington Post and the New York Times, they've got plenty of support already. So I figure I'll support people who are doing the work, who need a hand. And that often means journalism schools. In the U.S., in my case, it means the Columbia Journalism School. It means the Howard University Journalism School. And for that matter, the CUNY Journalism School, that's the City University of New York. The deal there is that CUNY, in general, represents the kind of college which has been more successful than maybe any in the U.S. of lifting people out of lower classes, people with no money, into the middle class and sometimes beyond. While I didn't go to CUNY, that's still my history. So that's kind of a side reason for supporting the folks at CUNY and higher education in the U.S. I have nothing against for-profit news or anything like that, but Jeff Bezos is a good fit for a Washington Post, and I'm not.
Okay. Jacoria? Did you want to address
I think
the
my
question?
colleagues have
Okay.
it covered.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yeah, I felt the microphone fall on that moment. Now, just a couple of things I know, and I want to set this for the audience and just ask a quick question. How many are from US-based news organizations here? It's going to be a small number relative. Okay, thank you. So, put a little more context here, then I'm going to go to a couple of your questions. First, we'll kind of talk about a broader question that may be a little more relevant to everyone in the room. Just a couple of explainers in case. Craig talked about CUNY, City University of New York, and he also mentioned Howard University, which in the United States is considered a historically black college. So you know the schools we just name-checked in rapid succession here. So, I'm going to go to one more question about what makes a strong proposal. Then I'm going to go into some of the Slido questions to get some more specifics. You know, so maybe, Jacoria, I'm going to do this last and start with Craig or Erika. When you're looking at, well, to the extent, Craig, that you're looking at them all the time, talk to us about what you think makes elements of a strong proposal. So, Erika, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say a few things, which is one, just be yourself. Don't try to be something you're not. Don't try to write in a voice that's not yours. Be true to your own mission, purpose, goals, passions, cares, fears, because that's you know, I think where the real power comes in a proposal. So I always caution against folks trying to sort of fit something in or feel like they need to be different. It's for us most useful and helpful to get to know you and your work and your organization. So I would name that. I think fewer words is always better. We read a lot of these. So you all are journalists, so you know how to edit. And then, you know, I think the other thing I would say is just, you know, clarity around the vision, you know, what and around goal. It's important for us to understand where you're headed. I have a lot of proposals that talk about things that they've done in the past. There's other ways for us to get that information, right? And what is really helpful for us is where do you want to go and how are you going to get there? So.
Craig?
When I'm looking for things, I'm looking for material which is casual and conversational in nature. I do look for people who are interested in real, genuine impact. Of the unusual things, though, that I'm looking for are an interest in working with people in the same space, cooperating with people, which often is as simple as when you see people in another group tweeting or something like that, you might consider retweeting them, even though that makes their efforts stronger. And I look for some ability also to speak up for yourself in a way that helps keep you safe. The deal is, and this is something I learned from Valerie Jarrett once, dragging me into the West Wing in 2009, telling me that no good deed goes unpunished. More specifically, it doesn't matter if you're doing the right thing, you have to be able to talk about it effectively, otherwise you can get really screwed. Because in the US there are people looking to manufacture or to fake culture war just so they can get attention. And as people say, the bad actors want to flood the zone with shit. So you do have to be prepared to support yourself. You have to be prepared to defend yourselves against bad actors who will threaten to disinform the public about what you're doing if you don't change something yet you're doing. So these are big effects. These are real things which are now a normal, at least in US journalism. Finally, I do ask potential grantees if they would be willing to humor me, to tolerate my sense of humor without actually encouraging me. That sounds like a joke, isn't.
Okay, so I want to, no, I'm a former grantee, so I understand what you just said. So, quite well. So I want to go to some of the questions that have come in on Slido. And because we're in Italy, I'm going to start with this one. Do your foundations have funds available for Italy, and or are there calls where Italian journalists can apply? And I know this is for Erika and Craig.
Sadly, no. All of our funding is in the Global South. We don't fund in Europe.
In my case, the great emphasis are for organizations in the U.S., but there have been some cases where organizations elsewhere have done things I believe in, and they've acquired U.S. 501c3 status. So once in a long while, it's a rare thing, I will do something along those lines, but it is an exception, and it has to be pretty mission-focused, given things that I'm interested in. One area is Reporters Without Borders and the Journalism Trust Initiative, because they're talking about journalism ethics accountability, and I think that might be useful in preserving democracy in the U.S. or elsewhere.
So kind of a follow-up really more for you, Erika. What's your vetting process for funding local organizations in the Global South? Do you find it easier to fund international news organizations that work abroad?
Yeah, I'm not the right person to ask this question, to answer this question. So we have 12 regional offices around the world, all based in the Global South, and they are the drivers of their strategy in their regions. So those decisions are not made out of the New York office. They're made by our colleagues that are in our regional offices. Each one has their own strategy, their own priorities, very much informed by what's happening on the ground in their countries and in their regions. So sorry, not to...
Thank you. It answered the question. So a couple of other broad ones before we go back to our conversation. And, you know, I think this one piggybacks on something that Jacoria said earlier, which is about kind of investing in building out long-term infrastructure. And I am trying to find that one, which is a little earlier in here. So I'm going to go to another one, and then I'll find that one in a second. So what is the success story for you when supporting journalism? This is for everyone. Jacoria, do you want to start?
I cannot say the success story yet because we have not
Yeah,
made
you're
grant
still
making
writing
or
that
strategy.
story.
I do not want to put the cart
Gotcha.
before the horse.
Yes, got it. Craig, do you want to start with that?
In terms of success stories that I've seen in journalism, everything I think is a project in motion. I've already seen good things coming out of Columbia Journalism Review, seen good work which is coming out of International Women's Media Foundation, particularly countering harassment. But everything I'm doing seems to be long-term. The only very short-term results I've gotten are from Poynter Institute and the ethics folks at Columbia Journalism School, which do restate that amplifying disinformation is wrong. this is long-term stuff, and that's just something I have to be patient about. Because we are talking about large-scale cultural and social change, which I might have to wait for in terms of decades to come. And so some of the mechanisms that I'm putting into place will hopefully operate for decades. And if it's the relief of any of my grantees here, I figure after the next 5 or so years, you don't have to worry about sending me any impact reports. But again, this is all very much long range. The literature of my people, the nerds, is science fiction. So that's the kind of way that I think about these things.
So I know, Jacoria, you're still pulling together, you're still building out grant-making strategy around journalism, and Erika and Craig have been in this space for a while. But you said something earlier that kind of connects with one of the questions that came in, and that question is around kind of long-term funding. And part of the question is, do funders see a point at which there's more operational long-term funding instead of the current grant-making process, where most money is project-based? I was really intrigued with what you said, because you talk about building out organizations and not just supporting movements. So in a little relating to voting rights and civil rights history in the U.S., so much has been said about there are movements, but the question always becomes, how do you build out organizations and create long-term? So just can you talk a little bit more, 2 or 3 points that resonate for you as you think about long-term support in planning your new grant-making strategy?
1,000%. I will say the reality is, out of all of the grants that we just made last year in 2021, there's 12. Majority of those grants were general operating support grants. We are in the democracy space. I am trying to move away from project support that limits grantees and the work that they're able to do, and actually puts a lot of strings on them. I'm trying to move away from all the impact reports that are required so that they can actually focus on doing their work, right? And that means strong, resilient organizations means being able to succession plan, right? Nobody's gonna be an executive director forever. But how are they able to do that work? To actually, you'll be surprised, some of our executive directors were the social media person, the communications person, the development person. They were all those things for their organization and more. And so our grant making is literally to do, hey, do whatever you need to do to build your capacity to build a sustainable organization over time. And this is trust-based philanthropy for us, right? We're learning, thank you. We're learning as we're going from them that helps us develop our strategy, and we'll refine it over time. But for the time being, you know better what your organization needs to hit your goals. And I think to the earlier question you asked, to add on to that, one of the greatest things I think can happen, now I will give credit that this was way before our funding cycle, but this was back when I was working in the work, and in 2019, I believe, 2020, one of these years, I'm gonna get it right. Yeah, it's all a blur. But, ultimately, one of our now grantees supports what's called in Georgia the peanut gallery, right? So in the states, you have what's considered your state board of elections, right? And then you have your local county board of elections, which are people who oversee the elections in each individual county. Now, in the state of Georgia in the United States, we have 159 counties. So you can imagine that's a lot of people, right? And so what they started was the Peanut Gallery, and it's a product of the New Georgia Project in partnership with the ACLU and a couple other organizations, and they empower local citizens to go sit in on their local county board of election meetings. So what happened in Randolph County is there was a consultant that came in, and that consultant recommended, to save the county money, that they should close 7 of the 9 polling locations in a predominantly rural Black community. And so that was found out by the Peanut Gallery of them attending those local board meetings. And ultimately, local journalism uplifted that story. It became from a local story to a state story, to a regional story, to a national story, which put pressure on. And ultimately, guess what happened? All 9 of those locations remained open for that election cycle. And that's when you can merge that grassroots work with the good, strong journalism to uplift power in communities and stop stupid, or at the same time, make progress.
Susan, can I just jump
Yes,
in on
please.
the?
It's a conversation.
I can't follow Jacoria, but I will just say, I just want to, this idea of the flexible support and the long-term support is just so incredibly important, and I think that it has been a huge problem in philanthropy, and when things are a problem in philanthropy, they cause problems in the world. And so, I just think this trend, and I'm so pleased and proud of the Blank Foundation that they're heading, that they're prioritizing this type of funding. It's just so important for the field. And I think Jacoria said earlier, when we fund around, that sort of democracy space around voting and elections, it can often be quite cyclical, which is tons of money comes in right before an election, floods these organizations, they staff up, and then it just, as soon as the election is over, that funding disappears, and so then they have to lay people off, and then there's this dry period, and then more funding comes in, and it's incredibly destabilizing for these organizations and for the field. And so this idea of having long-term, steady support for the organizations to do their hard work year-round is just, it's so, so important. I can't emphasize it enough.
Thank you.
I probably don't make things much better, since when it comes to philanthropy, I don't know what I'm doing, but I rely on the kindness of strangers, like I mentioned. Erika and others at Ford have been pretty helpful in this regards, and so I proceed along that basis in a manner which most development managers would find cringeworthy. Something useful that I should have mentioned before is that in an organization which is large enough to have a separate development manager, the development manager should know when to get out of the way, because especially if it's someone firsthand like me who's trying to learn something about the subject area, I do need to speak to the principals involved in doing something. So again, I do ask for patience from development managers. My methodology is indeed cringeworthy, and please tolerate that. It's not as bad as my sense of humor is.
So another question, and this strikes me as another one too. If you're a smaller organization, you're struggling with, we're just trying to do the work on top of, oh, we've got to apply for a grant and we've got to go through this process. So this question, it can be very complex and costly for small organizations to apply for grants with and manage grants from large foundations. What advice do you have for us?
Tell us that it's difficult. Be very honest, and I ask, solicit the feedback from our grantees all the time. Tell me what's wrong about our grant process and what makes it troublesome for you. Now, it doesn't mean write me a 10-page paper about how complicated it is. I'm not saying all of that, but being very transparent that, we may have to rethink our grant application process. Now, granted, there are certain things that will not move, right? And we have to, certain information that we have to capture, but ultimately, we only get better and serve people better when we understand we have a cycle of constructive feedback that we can continue to amend our processes to make it a better working relationship with our grantees, but also a better, even greater working relationship to serve the people that they serve and we seek to serve.
Okay, Craig?
In our case, what we found wise was to hire Mabel, who taught herself bookkeeping, finance, and then aspects of nonprofit law. So she built a process for applying for a grant, which is about as lightweight as the U.S. tax authorities would let us do, including an application supplying basics like the IRS determination letter and the state equivalent of that for whatever state's involved. The deal is that you can do everything that the tax authorities will eventually require you to do and demand that you have in line, but you can streamline the application process and the decision process as much as possible if you have Mabel. If you don't have Mabel, then it's not going to be as easy.
Yeah, thank you. So I really want to be mindful of the many questions that are coming in here. So as you see, we've started to ask these questions before we got to the last 15 minutes, because you have many questions, and many of these are things that we were going to discuss. So I want to make sure that some of these are answered, especially really explicit ones when you're looking for funding. So we have this question. Do you also fund small projects, or is there a minimum?
Yes, we fund small projects. We actually have something that we call an expedited grant process. So if it's less than $100,000, that's considered a small grant for us. It's a very easy application process. It moves very quickly for us. So
Small is relative.
yes.
I don't know if, yeah, Jacoria.
I was going to say the same concept goes for us. Anything under $150,000 is small, and it's a shorter grant process.
We do smaller grants at times, much smaller, depending on what's going on, what's involved, how effective the group might be. And our idea of small is smaller.
Oh, okay. So let me kind of, a few questions that are connecting and something, I think we should talk about. We look at prioritizing local, national, and one of the questions here is, how do you prioritize which is going to perhaps receive the lion's share of funding? So in the U.S., and this is an issue that's playing out globally to different degrees, just the basic information that people need every day to live their lives is, under challenge for a range of reasons. So you've got local community-based focus and you've got national. How do you weigh the two, or is it even a binary question for you? You're funding it all, but how do you determine priorities?
I think for us, it depends on what we are trying to accomplish at the time. Like I've said over and over again, we're transitioning right now overall for our organization. And last year when I made that $10 million in grants, that literally was focused on the South and the Southeast. Our youth development strategy is fully baked out now, and it's going to roll out in a couple of months. And ultimately, that's a national focus, right? So I think as our strategies continue to develop and as we continue to look forward, our focus is always going to be in Georgia. It's always going to be in Montana, because those are two states in which we are based. But even more than that, we will continue to think about ways of how we can look to kind of bind ties nationally, and also have ripple effects across the South, and like I said before, get people to play in the sandbox with us.
Okay. Yeah, I think, we fund national, state, regional, local. From Forward, we do have 6 kind of priority states that we have made a long-term, and again, I'm talking U.S., long-term commitment to fund organizations in those states. I can list those, maybe. Florida, Texas, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, and Louisiana. We have also separate funds, separate budgets specifically for Detroit. Because of the Ford Motor Company, we realize, our assets come and more built on the backs of people in Detroit. And so we have recommitted in recent years to make significant contributions to the community in Detroit. So that also is a place of priority for us. And then, clearly there's many different issues that folks are focused on at Ford. I personally fund a lot around, as I said, democracy, voting rights, civic participation. So I'm really looking at states where those things are under threat, under challenge, but also where there are really interesting opportunities to move things. So I'd say that's how we look at it.
Thank you.
I'm prioritizing based on my crude interpretation of where we are in world history, hence the focus on areas like combating disinformation and fighting harassment and providing potentially good cybersecurity for everyone. There, the phrase I'm using is cyber civil defense, because everyone here is a potential target. The more successful you are as a journalist, the higher profile you have when it comes to cybersecurity. Aside from that, as mentioned before, something I do prioritize is your resilience in the face of bad actors who may be trying to fake culture war, using your work as an excuse there. I will sometimes prioritize things at my whim. Despite my talk of pigeon rescue, it is not a high priority for me, although I do support 2 pigeon rescue groups and can recommend that they need to be wearing pigeon pants before they visit.
So I want to go to one question that is in, I don't know if our panelists could answer this, but recognizing that, we have people from all over the world in the room. So if Erika or Craig could answer this. If not, I'm sorry, we won't be able to answer this question. Did you have conversations with EU-based donors? What would you recommend? And can the state, the EU, play the role of a donor? Craig or Erika, is this something you're comfortable with answering?
I've been speaking with people, largely EU, UK, and in one case, Bangalore, about mutual funding for efforts. Usually it has to do with information warfare, specifically countering disinformation. That is starting, though, to increase in areas like cybersecurity, because we all have a common interest there, because both problems are getting worse. I'm considerably out of my depth when I'm talking to folks in those areas. Nevertheless, those things need to happen, and I may be funding a international cybersecurity group in the near future, but something like that hasn't been announced yet, and I'll be careful since I'm only potentially the Kardashian of cybersecurity.
Erika, no? Okay, all right, thank you. I hope we got a little bit to that one. Then this last one before we kind of come back and talk about a few more things as a group. Someone is asking if, as funders, and I think this applies to everyone at the table, if you don't just think about supporting the work, but the things around it, whether it's safety, legal support, all of the things that communications, but really looking at the legal issues and the need for defensive journalists that come up broadly around just doing the journalism. And, that could, be whether you're, in Ukraine or you're doing something in the Deep South in the U.S. So how do you look at providing the legal and safety support as part of your funding?
Yeah, I can respond to this in a couple of ways. So, one is we have something at Ford called our Build program, which is a 5-year commitment to help build capacity of some of our grantee partners. Those grants are large, they're flexible, it's a 5-year commitment, and at least part of it has to be for developing internal capacity and resilience of the organization, to Jacoria's point earlier. So that's one way, and that's very, we have a phrase at Ford that the grantee is in the driver's seat. So there's a first year of that grant where the grantee determines how they want to use the next 4 years of that grant to really build out their capacity, and they determine what their needs are and how they're going to do that. So that's one way. We also, in our journalism portfolio, have made a series of grants, some around specifically this legal support, providing support to organizations that are providing that service in the U.S., and then we also, both in journalism and really across our U.S. programs, try to find ways to support kind of networks and infrastructural and relationships, right? So we fund a number of organizations that probably many of you are members of that bring folks together, whether around particular cultural identities or other ways to put people in relationship with each other to build those relationships. And then, as Craig was saying earlier, we also fund a lot around sort of training, fellowships, associations. All of those also exist within our journalism, but also kind of across our U.S. programs piece.
Craig?
Journalism is hard, and it shouldn't be dangerous, but it is dangerous now. I mentioned before we have this counter-harassment effort only recently begun, and that's in motion right now. It can't return results fast enough for my sake. I've done 40 years worth of customer service and have now seen and dealt with a lot of harassment, and I take it personally, and it pisses me off. In the U.S., though, we do need lots of legal support for journalists under threat, so we do support pro bono legal services via Yale Law School. There's also something called media defense, which I think is out of the UK officially. So we support some of those things. Also, there's the Committee to Protect Journalists. These are efforts which deserve a lot more support because big organizations like the New York Times have all the mechanisms they need to protect people. But a great deal of journalism doesn't have those mechanisms. An area I would like to help, but no one, I need knowledgeable people to start with, is I guess what it would amount to would be low-cost, pooled media insurance, media legal insurance, because in the U.S. sometimes bad actors go after accurate legal reporting by suing the reporters, and that can easily drain any insurance a reporter might have. I know the situation of Mother Jones because they used to corner me in the elevator talking about the issue, and it is really big. On the other hand, like John Oliver on his show on HBO, they have the legal resources to defend themselves, but a lot of organizations don't. So that's an area which I know is important. I am available to, in a very modest way, help, but someone who knows stuff needs to be able to spearhead that one.
Thank you. Jacoria?
I think my colleagues have it covered.
Okay, thank you. So I want to move to close. We have a few minutes left here. And just, this is your moment to riff writ large. What is one piece of advice you'd give to people who are considering pursuing philanthropic support for journalism? We'll give you 2 seconds to sit on that one.
I'll go.
Okay.
You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So I think journalists can be some of the best researchers out there, and like all prospective grantees, do some digging and follow the money. If there are philanthropic organizations, whether it be Ford or one day, maybe next year, the Blank Foundation, that are funding the work you do, then I think you find the connection point and the alignment and reach out. The worst, my mom always had this saying, and still has the saying to this day, the worst anybody can do is say no. And so for now, like I said before, our foundation isn't making any additional grants in this space, but there are quite a few that stay connected with us to build the relationship for when we do, and the Guardian being one of those. And so, like I said, shoot your shot. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. And the worst anybody can ever do is say no.
Plus one to that. I think the other thing, Jacoria referred to this earlier, is, think about the relationship with your grant maker beyond the grant. There's so many other ways that we can be helpful, and we really want to be helpful. That's why we do this work. We can be amazing advocates for you. We can make introductions and connections. I would say at least half of my job is introducing people to each other, talking to other funders about the amazing work that I'm supporting. We've heard that we're in conversation all the time around this. Bringing people together, so we organize convenings to bring people together. We step out of the room, but we're happy to support it. Bring in facilitators, help pay for travel. We really want people to be working together in relationship with each other. So there's lots of ways that foundations can be supportive of you and help your work grow beyond the grant itself. The grant is critical, it's important, but really think about ways that you can, be in relationship with us and leverage, quite frankly, the power that we have to help build your work and your organization.
No good deed goes unpunished. What's worse is that sometimes there are bad actors who are really good at telling a good story, who may lure you into funding something which doesn't do what people hoped it would do. That's one kind of area. Also, there are times when you may wind up funding an area which has such a high profile that it attracts bad actors of completely unexpected sources. For example, I've supported PolitiFact and the International Fact Checkers Network, then to discover that for whatever reason, they've really gotten under the skin of hostile military intelligence sources or services, and the criticism resulting from that has been unexpected, not bad, But the thing is that sometimes you don't expect a good effort to be rewarded in that manner, but if you're successful, it will happen. Not in the case of pigeon rescue, but in other areas. Ask me about pigeon rescue later.
Well, thank you for your attention and thank you for your questions. And I want to thank the panelists, Jacoria, Erika, and Craig. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.